any judgment to this space. Also, some of the things that would be shared would probably be confidential. It's for everyone's discretion to be mindful of that. And then just like really ensuring that everyone who's present here in this space today feels safe and that well-being is taken care of. In case there are any concerns around the safeguarding and well-being, of course, you can reach out to me. I will also post the email ID of another person that you can reach out to who is not in this space, just in case you want to reach out to somebody who's not here with us. So with that, I think we can move to the next slide. And I can hand back to our host for the day. Joy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pooja, and thank you for being here. I do know that you're unwell. We really do appreciate you. So again, welcome. I am your host for the day. For those who may have joined late, my name is Joy Zawadi. I am the Executive Director at Akili Dada, and I am also the co-chair of the Adolescent Girls Investment Plan. Before I go into give you a bit of background of why we're here and also a bit of background on AGIP, I just want to give you a small indication of what our agenda for today looks like. So the core aspect of our conversation would be looking at the research that we have been able to work on together with GAGE, and I will introduce them shortly. We will also have a small roundtable discussion with some of the core participants of this research, just to unpack the insights and have a small discussion around that. We will have pauses in between to have your insights and your inputs. Please do use the chat box for conversations, but we'll definitely create a space for you to be able to share your questions, comments, and feedback for us. And so that's essentially what the program of the day looks like. We have fantastic speakers who will be joining us for this conversation. First and foremost, we have Dr. Kate Pincock, I do hope I'm not massacred your name, who is a researcher with the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence, GAGE, and who will basically be leading a core part of our conversation today. We also have Sandile Ndelu, again, I really hope I've not massacred your name, who is the Advocacy Manager at the FRIDA Young Feminist Fund. So we're really excited to have a representative from the philanthropic space joining us for this conversation. We will also be speaking with Pamela Elizabeth, who is with the Adolescents and Young Women's Project Coordinator at Let Girls Learn Initiative from here, Kenya. So we're again excited to have a conversation with her. And then lastly, we will have Vivian Oke, founder of ELLES App, which is a health tech and she's a health tech and fintech specialist, and also who participated in the research. So we're really excited to have them engage with us in this conversation. So why are we here? We are here because we are looking at the research that we've co-developed with GAGE, which is looking at resourcing girls, the potential and challenges of girl and youth-led organizing. And we are really passionate about this conversation because we do realize that there's significant gaps between people being aware of the need to invest in adolescent girls and young women, and converting that awareness into action. And action looks like commitment of resources, looks like actually support youth-led and girl-led organizations. And so we really wanted to just understand, where is the gap? What is that challenge? And I'm sure a lot of you here are also curious about that. Why is this really important for AGIP? For AGIP, which for those who are not familiar with the acronym, basically stands for the Adolescent Girls Investment Plan. And for us, this is really important because we are committed to creating a world where girls are empowered to make the choice to shape their own futures. And one of the key ways that we want to be able to do this is by producing evidence and research that we can actually use to advocate, but also hold others accountable. Since 2020, we've accomplished quite a lot, and you can read more about this on our website. We've collaborated with adolescent girls to conduct intergenerational dialogues, including the most recent one that we held at CSW 68. We have facilitated the participation of over 41 adolescent girls and youth in external events, including conferences, networking spaces, and global advocacy platforms. We've successfully advocated in conjunction with adolescent girls for the inclusion of Action 4, which is around strengthening young feminist-led and girl movements organizations in all the diversities, in the commitments around the Generation Equality Action Coalition, and of course, research, which is why we're here today. We published our research last year and launched it at Women Deliver, and this is just a follow-up conversation to that. We've partnered with GAGE, and for those who are wondering, again, who is GAGE? They're the Gender and Adolescents Global Evidence organization, and basically what they're looking at is what works for adolescent girls and boys when it comes to emerging evidence of addressing poverty and fast-tracking social change. And so they were a really ideal partner as far as the shared vision of having actually evidence for advocacy. And so for the next 90 minutes or just under 90 minutes, what we'll do is we'll delve into the findings, and I will shortly invite Kate to speak to that. We'll also have a deliberation or a discussion on the insights, and we do welcome your thoughts and your inputs as we're having these discussions, because for us, our research is really a lived document, a live document and an organic document. And so we invite you to give your input, but also we'll have the roundtable discussion, just exploring what does this mean then for our movements. And so, yeah, I really thank you for your participation. Thank you for giving us your time this evening. Last thing I will say before I hand over to Kate is we really want to carry this conversation to the online or the digital space. The hashtag we're using today is resourcing girls directly. That's hashtag resourcing girls directly. And so if there are any insights, any aha moments that really stand out to you, we invite you to be able to share that, not just within the space, but also with our online space. And with that, I will stop talking here and invite Kate just to share the findings and have the next 20 minutes to delve deeper into the research. Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you for that introduction and background. So we could go to the first slide, please. So we're really excited to share the findings from this report, and I'm going to talk mainly about the primary resourcing girls report, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the piece of research that we did looking at girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights activism alongside that. So just to give you a little bit of background to this research, there are 1.8 billion adolescents and young people globally, half of whom are girls and young women, and nearly 90% of them live in lower middle income countries. And as a result of this mounting interest in the value of investing in women and girls and gender equality and girls' rights, these issues are increasingly visible within global commitments and policies. So, for example, SDG 5 calls for states to achieve gender equality by 2030. The Generation Equality Campaign has accelerated collective action on achieving global gender equality. And part of this interest in what happens when you invest in girls is driven by this recognition of adolescence as a critical period of development. It's comparable only to the very early years of child development. It's a period during which, alongside lots of physical and emotional and cognitive changes, gender norms start to shape and direct girls' and boys' trajectories and opportunities in ways that often constrain girls while expanding the choices of boys. So this interest in investing in girls is also driven by a recognition of young people as torchbearers of gender equality and sustainable development. They're often at the forefront of social change movements and protests, and they're key actors in identifying solutions, the solutions that our world urgently needs. However, these shifts in recognition and pledges have not always transferred to on-the-ground benefits for girls in reality and practice. And research showed that only 5.5% of all ODA, official development assistance, between 2016 and 2021 went to programs addressing gender and adolescence. So that's a tiny proportion anyway. And within that limited amount, just 1% reached localized girl and youth-led organizations that could help drive transformational and sustainable changes in communities. So it's against this backdrop that this study is aimed to gather evidence on the experiences of girl and youth-led work across low and middle income contexts in order to understand a little bit more about what role they're playing within this broader ecosystem of girls' empowerment and gender equality, and to see what impact investing in girls can have. So next slide, please. So, as I said, the main objective of this study was to explore the experiences of these organisations and understand the contributions they make within this ecosystem of empowerment and development, as well as investigate the challenges that they face in carrying out and expanding their work. So this study answered 3 research questions. What are their characteristics? Who are they? What are they doing? What are the issues that they're tackling? Second, what are the major opportunities and contributions of girl and youth-led work? What are they doing and what impact do they have, especially around advancing girls and young people's well-being? And then what are the major challenges that girl and youth-led organisations face, including considerations on their resource base and impact measurement? And then alongside this broader study, as I've mentioned, supplementary research was undertaken with organisations working on sexual and reproductive health explicitly, and there's an accompanying report. But I wanted to just say something a little bit more about this. We thought this was really important to do because we know that during adolescence, girls face a lot of heightened risks and vulnerabilities related to their sexual and reproductive health. And those include early pregnancy and childbearing, unsafe abortion, STIs and HIV, sexual and gender-based violence, and a lack of age-appropriate services and information. So girl and youth-led organisations are increasingly being seen as really vital entry points for reaching adolescent girls and promoting sexual and reproductive health services and rights, because they're so close to communities and they really have a nuanced understanding of the challenges facing girls. However, we don't really know a whole lot about the exact role that they play in advancing these outcomes. And so similarly to the research questions that we explored in the main Resourcing Girls report, we looked at these in depth and specifically in relation to girl and youth-led sexual and reproductive health and rights activism. Thanks. So I'll just say something briefly about the methods so you can kind of contextualize the findings a little bit more. So we did a desk review of grey and peer-reviewed published literature on girl and youth-directed funding, but also substantial qualitative data collection with girl and youth-led organisations, girl and women-focused donors, and then various monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning experts. And then on top of that, 3 of the girl and youth-led organisations did their own further research with beneficiaries to find out what kind of impact their work was having in those young people's lives. And all of the organisations were invited to do this if they wanted to, and 3 of them took us up on that offer. So the evidence that we'll present is based on these findings. Next up. So first of all, I'm just going to say something about the characteristics of girl and youth-led organisations. And I've got some lovely pie charts here. You can see these in more detail in the report. So I think it's important to first note that whilst there's kind of a little bit of information on girl and youth-led organisations and what they do and who they are, it's quite partial. There's not really any comprehensive and detailed mapping and profiling in the evidence base. So we tried to contribute to that a little bit. Obviously, it's again partial just due to the nature of our sample. But we found that 4/5 of them were actually formally registered. Around half of them had been founded within the last 3 years, just data collection being completed last year. But then the other half were pre-2020, so had been established for slightly longer. Next slide, please. And then we found quite a lot of variety in the number of staff members that were being employed. So some of them, a small proportion, were only run by volunteers who were doing this all in their spare time. And then another small number, 16%, had 1 to 5 staff members. But then quite a few of them were substantially larger. So as you can see here, 2/3 of these organizations had more than 6 members of staff involved. And then in terms of numbers of donors, as you can see here, some of these organizations, 12%, had no donors whatsoever and were doing everything on a shoestring. And then over 1/3 had just 1 donor, which I think is notable, and we'll come back to that a little later. And then another 1/3 had between 2 and 5 donors, and then 20%, 19% had more than 5 donors. Type of organizational presence. So we looked at the different levels at which they're working, so community, national and international level. As you can see, just over half worked at both the community and national level within their country. We still have 18% who are working at an international level. And then in terms of types of funding, we looked at whether they had funding for specific and discrete projects, whether they had flexible funding, or whether they were able to maneuver both. And 60% had just project-based funding. Next slide, please. So it's the second part of our findings. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of contributions and impacts of girl and youth-led work. I think something that is really significant and notable in the report findings is that girl and youth-led organizations are working on such a diverse and enormous range of issues affecting girls and young people. And we've listed a few of them here: climate justice, sexual and reproductive health and rights, disability, child marriage, access to CSE, economic empowerment, gender-based violence. But often they were doing things beyond this scope as well. And the modalities through which they're engaging in these areas is also really varied. So for some, it was direct programming in schools. Some of it was completely outside of schools and not related to schooling. Some of it was through awareness raising and information. There was also a lot of work on social norms change, community health outreach as well as policy and legal advocacy. So, a really large range of ways in which girl and young people's rights and well-being being addressed. And for girl and youth-led organizations themselves, they felt very strongly that their added value is their ability to engage on the shared level with their target group and have a really not only good understanding of the challenges and issues that young people face, but also what will work to address these. And girl and youth-led organizations, through their activities, are very involved in trying to challenge discriminatory social norms. And this came up across all of the organizations. All of them see social norms as a major challenge that needs to be overcome. And one of the ways that this was addressed was through embodying role modeling behavior that challenges these norms and inspires other girls. And again, I'll come back to this in a little bit. But girl and youth-led organizations bring fresh perspectives and new ideas, and they organize in very different ways to kind of traditional gender equality and feminist movements in a lot of contexts. And the impact outcomes that girl and youth-led organizations are measuring don't only relate to the project outcomes that target communities, but also the skills that are developed by girls and youth who are involved in leading the projects themselves in terms of their own well-being and development. And I think that's something that's also very unique to girl and youth-led organizations that we've documented in this study, is that it's not only about the kind of collective social change that can be observed, but also about individual changes and the way that individual change can then trigger more collective and broader social change through this embodying and role modeling behavior. So next. So obviously that's a very brief overview of some of the contributions and impacts of girl and youth-led organizations, and I do encourage you to read the report for a lot more detail. But I want to talk a little bit now about some of the challenges that girl and youth-led organizations face in terms of resourcing and documenting impact. So first of all, resourcing challenges. As we know, girl and youth-led organizations face many barriers in trying to access funding. Often this is because they do not have the due diligence processes that are demanded by the larger international and institutional donors. And there are often ways around this for girl and youth-led organizations, but it is a challenge for them building those relationships with bigger donors. although some girl and youth-led organisations are formally registered, as we saw, so around 80% of them are formally registered, that 1 in 5 are not, and the barriers to this are cost related, the legal age requirements if they're under the age of 18, but also, and this is something we saw particularly in the groups who are working in the section on reproductive health and rights, is this concern with making work visible and making oneself visible as a sexual and reproductive health and rights activist in contexts where that can be kind of socially challenging or cause problems for girls themselves who are involved in this work. So I think that's something important to consider when kind of the expectation may be formal registration. And then limited donor transparency makes it often difficult for organisations to understand what funds are available, how to access them, if there are different parameters and expectations that they may not be aware of, often because these funding opportunities are available through relationships as well that may be pre-existing and therefore not accessible to girl and youth-led organisations. So there's a lack of transparency around funding opportunities. And then, as I think is quite obvious in the pie charts that showed where funding is going to, it's often for specific projects. So there's very limited flexible and core funds available to girl and youth-led organisations. So it's not that it's not wanted by girl and youth-led organisations and that they would prefer to have project-based funding, but it's flexible and core funds that can support things like staffing costs or organisational growth are just simply not really being made available to these organisations. Then next, please. And then related to resourcing to some extent, but also an issue in its own right, is the challenges that these organisations face in demonstrating impact. So girl and youth-led organisations struggle with how to define and represent the impact of their work. Traditional measures of performance do not always align with their capacities or the nature of their work. Whilst short-term measurable impact is presumed to increase accountability, so by encouraging reporting at regular intervals, actually that overlooks the reality that addressing social norms and gender equality is a long-term project, and it's very complex, requiring multiple stakeholders and actors' involvement, and really does need alternative impact measures to the ones that are being asked of girl and youth-led organisations. To be able to quantify the kind of contribution that they're making. And then, as noted earlier, there's this kind of presumption that this individual social norm change through role modelling and changing perceptions of girls will then lead to shifts in social norms. But that's not really being very clearly conceptualised either by donors or by organisations themselves, and that needs to be made clearer in order to demonstrate the impact and contribution that organisations are making. And then, while girl and youth-led organisations' strength is their knowledge of these community dynamics and of the challenges that girls face, we actually know very little still about how they challenge community hierarchies and overcome structural barriers and sustain these over time. So it's one thing to say that you're engaging with the community and bringing people together to address social norms that discriminate against girls. But then what is the measurement of the knock-on effects of that, and kind of monitoring that and seeing how that affects change in quantifiable ways for girls is more complex. Next slide, please. So I'm going to present one of the impact case studies that we present in the report. So the report it contains lots of these and they're great. We've organised them in terms of each organisation is presented with their identification of the problem facing girls, the approach that they take, what we can learn from what they do, and then their own recommendations. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of these now. I think maybe for time, we'll just focus on the first one, especially as we have Vivian on the meeting as well. We can talk a little bit about the ELLES App, if you don't mind moving to the other slide. I think it was the previous slide, sorry. Yes, perfect. So Vivian can talk a little bit more about this, but she and her colleagues began providing information through social media with the intent to kind of challenge and demystify some of the medical language around sexual and reproductive health and rights. Thank you. And empower girls and young people in Benin to claim these rights. And one of the ways in which they did this was through the development of an app, which covered issues relating to sexual and reproductive health, contraception, menstrual hygiene management, sexuality, and breast cancer prevention. So giving young women information to empower them to be able to kind of make decisions about their sexual and reproductive health. But they also do in-person community outreach, so it's working at multiple levels. And part of that awareness raising is with medical professionals as well, to improve their engagement with young people. And the way that they monitor their impact is through the number of users or views that social media posts receive, and how many people have downloaded the app, which is an impressive number of over 1,000 at the time of the research. And whilst they haven't been able to assess reach in physical campaigns or track how norms are shifting, as noted before, that's really challenging to do. They have noticed positive changes in medical staff attitudes, so that's one way of measuring those shifts. One of the recommendations of the group is for more resources to girl and youth-led groups, and not just funding. And I think often we think about funding as being the key resource, but also skills building and assistance with legal registration. But organisations like Vivian's also need support with improving their monitoring and data collection, so they can better report on impact, because they are obviously having impact and they're able to document it, but not in ways that kind of speak to the breadth and scope of what they're doing. And this can help donors to see the value of their investments, help with credibility and legitimacy with the government, for example, but also help organisations like this to understand what is working and what's not, and where to channel resources and energy. So I think maybe we'll skip the next impact case study, but there are lots of examples of these in the report for you to take a look at. And we'll just go to just some final recommendations and conclusions. So again, there's a lot more detail in the report, but I've tried to distill these to 3 core recommendations. So first of all, as mentioned in relation to the ELLES App, consider the multitude of ways that donors can support organisations run by girls and young people that's beyond just funding. So that might be capacity building, skills development, networking opportunities, and other resources, which are all really valuable and important for girl and youth-led organisations to expand their impact and do the work that they know is valuable. Second, so one of the difficulties we can see is that there's a huge diversity of the ways that impact is being quantified and measured by different girl and youth-led organisations. And often that makes it quite opaque for donors to really understand what's being done and how it's effective. So having some harmonisation of impact measurement can be really useful for improving understanding of what kind of impact that girls and youth-led organisations can work towards. And some of the ways of doing that have to be through engaging girl and youth-led organisations as contributors to these processes, especially because not only do they understand what kind of impact they're able to have, but also they can kind of provide that creativity and insight into developing appropriate measures, but also measuring their participation in the wider social change ecosystem, including as a catalyst for social norm change. We've mentioned this in relation to sexual and reproductive health and rights, but also on other issues too. Because girl and youth-led organisations, they not only, although they are obviously impactful, the burden of responsibility for impact and social change should not fall on them alone. It should be recognised that they are part of a wider ecosystem of girls' empowerment and gender equality, and making those connections is really, really key for understanding how everything is interlinked and how we can kind of build into long-term sustainable change. And then taking account of the realities of those timeframes for change need to be central to the design of monitoring and evaluation and accountability and learning approaches. And then finally, pilot different resourcing models for organisations and investigate their respective impacts. So of course, we're calling for more research, but also kind of more experimentation. So explore kind of what works in terms of different support structures, different kind of linkages that can be made to other parts of the social change ecosystem to strengthen the capacities of girl and youth-led organisations. Engaging with a broader spectrum of organisations involving young people and girls to widen opportunities for more diverse subpopulations. So although I haven't spoken about this heavily in this presentation, there are still concerns that it's only certain young people who are able to have the opportunity to join in with this kind of social organising, and to be part of girl and youth-led organisations, and we need to diversify that. So one of the challenges that I think is spoken about by young people, the young women who were involved in the report and the research, is just the continued marginalisation of young women and girls with disabilities from this kind of activism. And then finally, ensure that piloting initiatives are underpinned by decent impact evaluations so that we can really learn from them and it's not wasting time. So I think that's it from me. There are some other conclusions in the report if you'd like to take a look, but I'll hand back to Joy now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think the research is definitely meeting such a huge need within our ecosystem, and can definitely be used for advocacy and saying, hey, a lot more resources need to go to girl and youth-led organizations. In fact, I have so many questions, but I want to give the audience an opportunity to field their questions. We have just about 5 to 10 minutes for this session of the webinar. And so in order to field your question, just feel free to unmute yourself, ask your question. I ask that you keep your question concise so that we can get at least 2 or 3 to discuss at this point. So the floor is open, just unmute, ask your question briefly and concisely, and we'll have Kate respond to the questions. Anyone in the audience?
Hello, this is Lillian from Kenya.
Go ahead,
Hello.
Lillian.
Yes, thank you. I think this is really eye-opening and insightful, triggering a lot of thought processes. My question is on the age group of the adolescent girls that were leading the organizations you targeted. Do you have a particular age group? Do you have any data on their ages? Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. We can take 2 more questions, and I will read out the question in the chat box, but I want first to give it to anyone else who has a question. Again, just unmute, ask your question, and we'll have Kate respond to them. All right, I'll give it 1 more second in case there's anyone who wants to ask. All right, so the question in the chat comes from Sarah, and she's asking, how did you select the countries that you worked in for this research? What did you see as the issues of selection bias, and how might this affect the interpretation of your results in their broader applicability? What additional measures of impact would you like to have used but had to dismiss because of lack of visibility? And in what languages was the grey literature that you reviewed? So I think we will pose. Let me read 1 more question, and which is a follow-up to Lillian's question. What is the educational background of the targeted adolescent girls? So we'll pause there for your responses, Kate. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much for these questions. Yeah, they raise really important things, and I guess I didn't talk enough about the methods. But just to say about the sample, so the sampling was initially done through, we did a stakeholder mapping in partnership with AGIP to identify the key intermediary funders to review. And then we took a snowballing sampling strategy. So participants from girl and youth-led groups were identified through kind of recommendations from other research participants, and then they were able to refer each other. Obviously that has its own limitations in that there's a kind of self-selecting process going on. And just to also note on the kind of educational background and the age group of girls, this meant that we relied on self-reporting from girl and youth-led organisations. We didn't verify whether they were indeed within a certain age group to be considered a youth-led organisation. We, if they self-identified as such, then we included them in the study. To also answer Sarah's question about the sort of issues around selection bias and language, the literature that was reviewed was all in English. I mean, in part, that's because the majority of what's been written about the funding of girl and youth-led organisations has been published in English, but clearly it is an issue in that we might have missed some key publications from other contexts and languages. We did try very hard to get a decent geographical spread of organisations, so that was a consideration in the sampling strategy as well. We didn't want to heavily focus on any one particular region of the world, so we tried to get a good kind of distribution to get a sense of what was happening globally. And then in terms of additional measures of impact, I mean, so for measuring impact, again, it was self-reported impact by organisations was what we were really interested in, was kind of understanding how girl and youth-led organisations themselves see and understand impact, and then thinking about that in terms of how impact is being measured more broadly in terms of from the perspective of monitoring and evaluation and learning experts. And so in the report, we do discuss some of the tensions between that, which is widely recognised and quite well documented within the literature. But there's not been a lot of work looking at how girl and youth-led organisations themselves are quantifying impact. I think I've answered all the questions, but please, anyone pull me up if I've missed anything.
All right. Thank you so much, Kate. As we consider the additional questions that are coming in, don't worry, we will come back to them. But I want us to segue into the roundtable discussion with some of the participants in the research. So if we could go into the section of insights and perspectives. And I want to bring in Sandile. Sandile, as you introduce yourself, maybe you could provide with us just your thoughts on how funding mechanisms can better support the work of girl and youth-led initiatives. And I know that FRIDA has had quite some significant work in this area. And also just highlight how are you achieving this and how can you also challenge the philanthropic ecosystem to be able to put their money where their mouth is. Over to you, Sandile.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Joy. I'm so happy to be in this space and to be in community with you all. So my name is Sandile Ndelu, and I'm from FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund. And one of the things that that sort of struck me the most as I was going through this piece of research was the fact that adolescent girls are not a monolith, and that in many ways they contain multitudes that are deeply diverse, deeply intersectional, and that there's a need for us to interact with them as such. And that diversity, that richness should color how we accompany adolescent girls, adolescent girl groups, and ultimately the adolescent girl movement. And so I think there's several ways in which funders can deepen their relationship with adolescent girls for maximum impact. And sort of be more responsive to the diverse and changing needs and wants of this particular community or class of young feminist activists. And this sort of engagement, of course, has to go beyond, and I think Kate made a mention of this, has to go beyond the provision of resources. I think it's really important to perhaps even emphasize in this space that while providing longitudinal core funding and flexible funding is important and key, it isn't the whole picture, right? And funders and donors have to do more. I'm going to spend, I think, some time perhaps speaking about some of the things that FRIDA has done in terms of its own grant-making practice, and how these can perhaps be a starting point for some of the donors in the room who may be interested in, I guess, leveling up their grant making to adolescent girls. The first thing that I want to touch on briefly is around participation, right? So FRIDA is a participatory grant making funder, and our participatory grant making process allows adolescent girls to directly make the decisions in terms of where the resources that we hold in trust or that we are custodians of, where those resources end up going. And what I mean by this is very literally adolescent girls who apply during our call for applications actually are the ones who vote during that process for which other groups who are applicants during that cycle, who they think should be the recipients of the resources during that cycle. And this is a deeply democratic and participatory process. And I think it also touches on the importance of being accountable to the movement. The resources that funders such as FRIDA hold do not belong to FRIDA, right, as an organization. They belong to the movement. And thus the movement needs to make decisions in terms of where those resources ultimately go, what issues, what concerns, what regions those resources ultimately benefit and nourish during a particular cycle. And so that was the first point, participation. The second point, and I think again, Kate touched on this as she was going through the summary of the research. In fact, I think it was the first recommendation that Kate shared was around sort of going beyond sort of grant making and sort of the importance of funders having to provide additional support and accompaniment for adolescent girls. At FRIDA, we have what we call an accompaniment and a capacity strengthening program. And within this accompaniment and capacity strengthening program lies various initiatives which we have designed and engendered in order to enrich the experience of adolescent girls as they do their work. An example of this is, for example, that we act as a bridge between various adolescent girl collectives. And so, for example, an adolescent girl collective that, for example, is working on sexual and reproductive health rights issues in Uganda has the opportunity to cross-pollinate and have conversations with a similar group in Peru, right? And so that sort of cross-movement, transnational interaction as a funder that has a presence in multiple regions, that's the role that we're able to play, and an additional value that we are able to provide to the young feminist and adolescent girl movement. Another accompaniment program that we have is what we're calling the transition strategy.
Who am I speaking? Please mute, or if Malo, you can be able to mute them so that Sandile can continue speaking.
So I was saying that another example of the one of the accompaniment initiatives that we have engendered at FRIDA is what we call the transition strategy, which is essentially an investment in the sustainability of young feminist collectives and adolescent girl collectives by putting them in contact and sort of fostering a relationship with other donors and other funders, so that when they ultimately age up, we are a young feminist fund, and we imagine that at some point, for some reason, these collectives sort of age out of the FRIDA community. We don't want our relationship of no longer funding that particular collective at a particular moment, meaning that the work cannot continue. And so we put them in contact with other funders who may be interested in funding some of the work that they are doing. And so we're putting a lot of resources in creating those relationships so that we can essentially cross-pollinate and ultimately serve the sustainability of the movement. And then the last example of one of the initiatives that we put in place is the advisory. So at FRIDA, we are powered by a really robust and active advisory committee that is representative of the broad diversity of the young feminist movement. The advisory committee has advisors from all regions where we have where we operate or where we have a presence. It also has a particular group of advisors who are adolescent girls. And that advisory committee is essentially FRIDA's window to the movement. The girls and young feminists who sit as part of the advisory are active participants in the movement, and they are able to tell us in real time and advise us in real time how to move forward, right? They are also able to help us reach adolescent girls and young feminists faster and more effectively, because oftentimes they're also based in the region. And so if we want to organize a gathering of young feminists who understand a particular development in a particular region or sub-region, they are able to put that together in a really agile manner and helps FRIDA, and then feed some of those insights back into FRIDA so that they dictate and color how we move forward. And I think related to that, we also have focal points. And so we have staff members who we call focal points. These are people who are oftentimes, in fact, not oftentimes, all the times, based within the various regions that they take care of. They have come up from these young feminist and adolescent movements in their particular regions. So they know the issues, they know the terrain, they know the culture, they know the nuances, and they are the people, they are sort of the first point of call that each adolescent girl collective has with FRIDA. And they accompany them throughout their relationship with FRIDA. And they also help us, similarly to advisors, to take in and absorb feedback that we're getting from the movement. And that again then colors some of the initiatives that we have. And so a lot of the initiatives that I've mentioned today have not sort of come about by osmosis, or some people sort of sitting around a table and deciding on them. These have come as a result of adolescent girls, young feminists saying, hey, this is actually something that we need. We've then gone back to the drawing table and sort of innovated in terms of how we can make, or how we can be responsive to some of those needs that have been communicated to us. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Sandile. What you shared has deeply, deeply resonated with me, and I'm sure with many others on the call, as you can see in the chat, especially around the question of funding or resourcing is not just about money. It's about networks. It's about investment in the organization development. It's about even cross-learning and cross-sharing. So thank you to FRIDA for modeling that way. And please do let us know how we who are on this other side of the spectrum can help in terms of donor education and just spreading your model so that we can have a lot more impactful funding across the board. So I will pause on taking questions until the entire group of speakers has given their inputs. And I quickly want to move to Pamela. So if you have any questions for Sandile, please, or comments, please put them in the chat box and we will revisit them. But for Pamela, what actionable steps do you think need to be taken to enhance the visibility for girl and youth-led organizations? And please speak to this in terms of where you sit, and also what kind of support do you, based on the research and based on your own experiences, do you feel is really needed for girl and youth-led organizations? Over to you, Pamela.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I'm happy to be here, and I can say that I'm always with the girls and young mothers in my day-to-day life, and I can say that I have noticed some of the strategies since I've been with them regarding this question. Actually, I think we can highlight the fact that we as Let Girls Learn has ensured that the rural girls are at the center of all our interventions. As leaders in the organization, as the program implementers, and as the designers, in this regard, I can say that Let Girls Learn has actually revised its strategy, of which we can also, as different organizations, we can also copy. We've revised our strategies to ensure that about 80% of the secretariat and board are led by rural girls. Yeah, and those in need, actually. This has built their power and urgency to lead and decide the course of the organization. And I think as at now, what is just lacking is just the resourcing to ensure that their ideas are put in practice. So I think that one is number one strategy that we can use, making sure that the girls, the adolescent girls, and maybe the young mothers, they are the secretariat part of it. This one will make them learn, will motivate them, and will actually make their self-esteem high, and through that also may make other girls in our communities to be empowered as well. About the support needed that you've just asked, the support needed, actually I can relate this with a lot of challenges that our girls, the rural girls, experience. Because if we say or when we promote the support needed, when we promote the education of the girls, because this one is a challenge to most of the rural girls. They are limited to access education. So when we promote education through empowering them, through making sure that the barriers they face while they are going to schools or when they are going to their education, we actually narrow that one can actually be a good support to them, and they can improve and reach their full potential. Another support maybe that we may need as adolescent girls or rural girls is the economic empowerment, or because we realize that there's economic inequalities, which are most rural women or most rural girls often engage in substance farming or informal labor. So when these young mothers, these adolescent girls, they are empowered economically, we realize that they will be self-sustainable, and actually this one can lead to more rural girls being empowered educationally. Again, another support that we need much more capacity building on gender-based violence, because most girls here in rural, I'm speaking in the perspective that I'm in a rural place where we experience this gender-based violence or gender violence with the girls. We realize that most of the girls, most of the women are more susceptible to gender-based violence due to limited access to support services and weak law enforcement. So when actually their capacity built, they know their rights. I think there will be the girls will be more of let me say more of they will be more of, they know their rights, they will be more of, they know what they want to do, and they will be more of, their rights are defended as rural girls and also as young mothers. And also maybe another support that we may need also, maybe about the health issues. Found that most of the girls, most of the adolescent girls, they experience their menstruation maybe every end month, and because of the background, let me say humble background they come from, they are not able to maintain their the hygiene, the good hygiene, and you find that they lack access to quality healthcare, or let me say they lack this the items they can use during their menstruation, and this one make them to be at the back of whatever they're doing, because they're not let me say exposed out. And maybe if we introduce a good healthcare through maybe educating them on sexual reproductive health right, gender-based violence, and so on, how maintaining their hygiene, this one can make a good move to them, because they will be able to know how to actually maintain their bodies and so on. I don't know if I've answered that question, but I've tried to link it with the challenges we experience, so that you see the need of the support that the rural girls actually experience as rural girls experience, according to whatever we have been experiencing in our day-to-day lives or in our communities. Again, we need support. We need support in emotional support, relationship, or such things, because we find that most of the girls in the rural areas, majority are depressed. Like, just let me say, in case an adolescent girl is pregnant, no support is given to this person. The parent negligence actually here, because they feel like this is an outcast thing, and also the girl feel like she is neglected, or she might even disappear from home. So like, we as the organizations, we can give the support, emotional support, relationship support, by just encouraging this person on how she can maintain her life, so that in the process where when the pregnancy is on, the girl realizes that there is some people that still cares for her. And this has come about, let me say, this has come about in the case where the perpetrator, you might find that the person that has impregnated the girl, let me say the perpetrator, has disappeared or is a family person. This person, you find the case is not followed up or something like that. So the girl also, the parents may even tell her to go to get married at that tender age, of which that one is a big challenge. So we need to give them support, emotional support, and also the relationships support, so that they feel like they are people in the society. I don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah.
Yes, you have, Pamela. Thank you so much for that articulation. And I just want to echo what David has indicated in the chat, is that you've actually named the reality and the context of adolescents and youth. And so even when we're talking of resourcing, it cannot be a one-size-fits-all kind of resourcing. And I also really loved that you touched on and also really echoed what Sandile mentioned, is that girls are the experts in their own lives. And so having them at the decision-making table, whether when it's determining where the resources should go, or it's in, in the organization and making decisions about what the programming looks like, is really, really powerful. So thank you so much, Pamela, for sharing that. Once again, if you have any comments or questions for Pamela, please put them in the chat box and we will revert to them just before the end of the call. I would like to now shift quickly to Dr. Vivian. And my question to you, and this is really tagging on one of the insights that Kate had shared, is that the way girl and youth-led organizations look at impact is not the same way that traditional philanthropy looks at impact. So maybe you could share what your experiences has been in challenging the way you measure impact from the traditional approaches to M&E, and what that has resulted in, or what opportunities have emerged from that process. Yeah, over to you, Dr.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank you for inviting me on this conversation and giving me the opportunity to speak and highlighting the work we've Vivian Oke. I'm a physician from Benin Republic in West Africa with a focus on sexual and reproductive health and on health tech. I'm very glad to be here because I've been one of the grantees of the Equality Accelerator Fund to be at the Women Deliver. I will briefly start first by talking a bit about me. So I'm 23 years old. And when I was in medical school, I went through a depression because I realized that medical doctors in LMICs are not as superheroes as we could think, because we've been facing a lot of challenges, as seeing women dying of preventable death. And then I have to find my why. Why was I still able to stay in medical school to be a medical doctor despite all those challenges? And the answer that I found was that I could be able to bring the accurate health information for people in communities so that they do not come late in hospital. So that's how I started with Dr. V, the Youth for You doctor, so that youth feel free to express themselves. And I started on social media. When I started, there was a lot of youth that were writing to me, and I couldn't handle all this just by myself. So we thought about a place, even if it's virtual, where there could be many health workers and where youth, mainly women, could find the accurate health information about their sexual and reproductive health and beyond, about the women's health in general, including their mental health,
the dialogue between parents and children, everything where they could find it. And then when they have some specific needs, they could address them to a health worker. So that's how we started with the ELLES App, that is available for the moment on Play Store, and that will soon be launched, and that will be available again on App Store. I'm sorry for the noise around me. I'm currently at the ICPD in Cotonou right now. I was supposed to send some pictures, but I will send them soon. So for the question that has been asked, I will say first, as a youth-led organization and a GAGE-led organization, we do not have the, I will say, we do not have as our common habits to have data, to collect them and all those things. We've already started in communities through the app before thinking about monitoring our data, monitoring our impact. And that's why I think, as it has been said earlier, it's important to invest in girls and women-led organizations, not just for about money, but about capacity building on those issues. And recently started monitoring our data, as it has been said, through the number of people downloading the app, through the impressions on our social media, and through women and girls that have been impacted in our community activities. We've been doing community activities because we realized that through the app for the moment, we couldn't touch directly girls that did not receive a formal education. So we have community activities so that we could reach them in local languages, even though we are planning to have some way of reaching them, not directly by the app, but like an USSD code in local languages so that it could directly impact them while not using internet. So I hope I answered your question. If I didn't answer your question correctly, maybe I could come back if there are other concerns that I could enlighten. Thank you.
No, you did answer my question, and I love that your organization has taken a completely different approach to tracking impact. One last question I think I would like to ask you is, from where you sit, what challenges have you faced, especially when it comes to connecting with other organizations working on the same issue as you?
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to get you.
What challenges have you faced, as a youth-led organization or a girl-led organization in connecting with others working on the same issue as you?
Thank you. So I will say one of the challenges we faced was firstly about like organizing ourselves as youth on how we were going to proceed and work. And since we were a lot of health workers, how were we working on both community activities, the app, and then our medical studies that takes a lot of time. Apart from that, I will say the challenges that we had were about funding. Till now, we didn't receive a formal funding, but we are thanking God because now we are receiving a funding from Plan International, a flexible funding, because we weren't registered. We are actually registering, and we are on this process because when you have, for example, some technological solutions, when you are recording some data, the process is not as quiet, easier as if you was doing something else. And we thank God that we have, for example, these types of flexible funding, because since the moment we launched it, we did it with our personal funding. And I could tell you that it has been very expensive. It has been for more than $2,000 to develop such a solution. And what helped us was working in partnerships with other organizations so that we could reach more and more guests. So I will say the organization, the funding, and now the issue we have is about capacity building. We really need support for capacity building for how we are going to make it sustainable, even if there is no more funding right for the moment, because it's okay, it's great funding, but how are we working for these initiatives to be more sustainable, even when the time of the funding is at its end? So that's what I could say.
Thank you, Dr. Vivian. I think there's something so profound that you have said, which is investment in capacity building for sustainability. A lot of girl and youth-led organizations get the question of how is your work sustainable? But there's not enough resources that actually goes to even creating that space to reflect on what sustainability actually means for us. So thank you for bringing that out. Kate, I'll come back to you. Having listened to the rest of the speakers, I just want you to reflect on how can stakeholders collaborate more effectively? I mean, thinking about what Dr. Vivian has also shared, is how can we collaborate more effectively to ensure there's diversity in the way funding is allocated, both bilaterally and multilaterally? But also, how can we even access more funding? So just based on the research that you have shared. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Joy. It was so interesting hearing from the speakers. Thank you so much to all of you as well. I think, oh, apologies for not starting my video. Sorry, it's getting a little dark here. I think one of the key things that emerged from the research is that a lot of the time that this information about who is being resourced in terms of the kind of heterogeneity and diversity of girl and youth-led organizations is not being captured by donors. It's almost seen as sufficient to just say that it's funding for a girl or youth-led organization. And I think as many of the comments and the speakers have highlighted, that really obscures the fact that we need to take a more intersectional approach to funding and resourcing girl and youth-led organizations to ensure that there's appropriate representation, but not just in terms of kind of making sure that there are diverse faces at the table, but because if the strength of girl and youth-led organizations is their real understanding of the challenges that girls and young people face, then we need to make sure that the whole kind of range of young people's experiences are also being kind of put at the center of girl and youth-led organizing. Would you mind just asking your second question again, Joy? It was about, I think it was something about how can we kind of access more funds?
Yeah, how can we collaborate more effectively to access more funds? And this is coming from the background that a majority of youth-led organizations and girl-led organizations are grassroots, are in the global south. And, the challenges that you spoke to in terms of we are considered not to have the structures or traditional ways of measuring M&E. So what collaborative efforts can we actually take to be able to access that kind of funding?
I think it's a good question. It's not something that we have really delved into with the findings of the report, but just kind of speaking to the evidence that there is out there. I think this is something that probably donors and intermediaries should be taking more responsibility and accountability for as well. So that the onus isn't just on girl and youth-led organizations to be reaching out to others and creating these networks, but for this to be put in place, in recognition that this wider ecosystem approach is really important for creating sustainable change, and for ensuring that the kind of networks that we need for that are in place. Maybe others will have ideas on how this could work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd really love to put that question out to our audience, and also to hear what are your thoughts, what are your reflections based on the discussions that we've had I'm really curious about your aha moments, even as we've had these discussions. And as we, again, feel free to just unmute and share your comments, but I'll just read a few that are in the chat box here. Martha says, not only is there a need for broad girl representation and diversity of thought and experience, but also diversity in the types of skills. And I completely do echo that. And also Leslie says, it would be great to see donors establish flexible funding or budget lines into programming for youth-led organizations components towards capacity building and advocacy with some flexible monitoring measures in place. Thank you, Leslie. And I think that really echoes FRIDA's model. And I really do wish that they could take it upon themselves to do a lot more advocacy, even within the philanthropic ecosystem. And so I will stop here for just to open the floor for any thoughts, reflections, aha moments that are coming up for us, or even challenges to help us really enrich the research. All right, there's a question here. How do I get in touch with FRIDA? I believe Sandile will be able to respond to that. But the floor is open. Once again, feel free to unmute and ask your question, give your comment, or input. All right. Any thoughts? Again, I'll read what's in the chat from Kate. I loved Vivian and Joy's final point about donors who want sustainability, also needing to recognize that this requires proper funding. Yeah, so just to echo that as well. Any thoughts or reflections? All right, if there are none, I would just want to go around our speakers for today. Maybe just share your one aha moment and your one call to action for anyone who's on this call or who will see this recording at a later stage. And we will start with Sandile, then Pamela, then Dr. Vivian, and then close with Kate. Over to you, Sandile.
Right. So I think something that's definitely sitting on my mind at the moment is that adolescent girls shouldn't be required to shapeshift and contort themselves to align to the priorities of funders and donors. The power dynamic demands that be the other way around. It is funders, it is donors who must make themselves in the image of the young feminist movement. And so when it comes to issues such as sort of monitoring and evaluations, whatever, right? The entire sort of ecosystem of concerns that adolescent girls have, funders need to must make themselves in the image of the young feminist and adolescent girl movement. Yeah, I'll stop there. That would be my call to action. Funders need to change. Girls, adolescent girls, young feminists do not need to change anything. And hopefully, if there are other funders who are on the call today, we'd be very much happy to journey on that sort of journey together. Yeah, I've shared my email address in the chat, and I'm happy to continue this conversation outside of the space as well.
Fantastic. For anyone who's tweeting, that's the tweet. Thank you, Sandile. Over to you, Pamela. What's your aha moment and your call to action for anyone who's listening to this recording or joined us for this conversation?
Okay, great. I can see that when women and girls are healthy, they are much more likely to advance in their education. And I can say this from the report that I read in January 2024 by the World Economic Forum and the McKinsey McKinsey Health Institute, where they suggested that invest in women's health will boost the world economy, improving women's health in rural communities, and also can impact on their education and economic outcomes due to several connected factors. And maybe I can say when we do this, there will be increase in participation of girls, of adolescent girls in decision making, and also ensure that adolescent girls' education does not suffer. And also this will help in prioritizing provision of adolescent girl-led friendly health information and also services to include mental health issues and sexual reproductive health rights. And also through this, we'll tackle gender-based violence in all its form to improve security for adolescent girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Your passion just completely blows me away. And I do totally agree with you that investing in health is such an important priority, and it does really impact the rest of the development indicators. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Vivian, your aha moment and your parting shot.
Thank you. I would like to say that girls and women on the continent and youth on the continent are already having some impact with the few resources that they have. Imagine if they are supported in terms of funding, in terms of networking, in terms of capacity building, how great the impact would be. Invest in girls and youth-led organizations for an impact coming from their country to the world. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Dr. Vivian. That's another tweet. Girls and young women are making an impact, and youth are making an impact in their communities. Imagine how much more they could do if we invest in them. So invest, invest, invest. And last but not least, Dr. Kate, Kate, what's your aha moment and your call to action?
Thanks, Joy. I think I have had many aha moments, but just this latter point about, everyone wants sustainability, everyone wants long-term change, but no one wants to fund it, I think it's really powerful. Just thinking about the kinds of funding that are being made available to girl and youth-led organizations. Do they support the goals of donors? I think, the evidence shows that at the moment, not really. But my parting shot would also be that whilst, the achievements of girl and youth-led organizations are incredible and deserve to be celebrated. They're often, happening on a shoestring, very minimal funding, minimal support, and recognizing and celebrating that, yes, we want to do that. But at the same time, we need to recognize that girls' activities must be underpinned by kind of movements that demand structural transformation. It's not enough to simply divert funding to girls' organizations and then place the burden of responsibility on them for gender equality and the empowerment of adolescents. This has to be part of a broader scaffolded ecosystem in which there is structural change, appropriate services and resources to support girls that need to be sustainably funded and delivered at scale. So it's beyond just girl and youth-led organizations, but creating this system in which they're properly supported and funded and complemented by appropriate services as well.
Thank you, Kate. I'm not going to water down your parting shot and your call to action. And thank you, everyone, for really engaging with us and having this fantastic conversation. I'm happy to see the connections that are happening in the chat box. Please exchange emails. Please exchange LinkedIn information so that we can carry on this conversation moving forward. I will pause here and invite Maloa and the AGIP team to tell us what's next, and then we'll be happy to close the webinar. Maloa, over to you.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was a really lovely call. I'm sorry for that little snag at the end. So coming up next, we'll just share a post-webinar survey that will be sent directly to your email. We invite you to sign up for a newsletter where you can get to connect with all our wonderful members, just to let you know that Let's Girls Learn Initiative and FRIDA are also part of the AGIP membership, as is GAGE and of course our co-chair Akili Dada. So please do feel free to connect. We'll also have the link to download research. It's on the the right of your screen, but you can also just check it out in the post-webinar survey. So thank you all for just participation. I'll hand it over to you, Joy, just to close. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Maloa, and thank you to the AGIP and GAGE team for developing this fantastic research. I believe all of us can use it for our own advocacy, and also just making sure that we do get more resources channeled to girls and youth-led organizations. And with that, I again invite us all to connect. Please share your insights again on Twitter. The hashtag is resourcing girls directly. Do connect with each other on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and in the emails that have been shared therein. And we look forward to having subsequent conversations with you all. Thank you so much and have a fantastic evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Asante.